August 1845, Hampshire, England. The Victorian workhouse system was about to face its most horrifying scandal, one so depraved it would shake Parliament and expose the depths of human suffering hidden behind institutional walls. The nightmare began with whispers from the countryside around Andover Workhouse. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange sounds coming from the bone-crushing yard. Not the rhythmic pounding of hammers, but something far more disturbing. The sound of fighting. Desperate, animalistic fighting over scraps of rotting meat. Colin McDougal was the master of Andover Workhouse, a former sergeant major who had fought at Waterloo and brought military discipline to his civilian command. His wife, Mary Ann, was described by the chairman of the Guardians as a violent lady. Together, they ran the workhouse like a penal colony. Inmates ate with their fingers like animals. They were denied even the meager Christmas celebrations afforded to paupers elsewhere. Any man who dared speak to his wife during meals was thrown into the refractory cell, a punishment hole where men were left to rot in their own filth. The workhouse's primary industry was bone crushing. Able-bodied men were assigned to the boneyard, where they used 28-pound iron rammers to pulverize old bones from horses, dogs, and other animals into fertilizer. It was back-breaking, hand-blistering work that left faces scarred from flying bone shards. But the bones weren't just from animals. Rumors whispered that some came from local graveyards, human remains mixed in with the livestock carcasses, all destined to be crushed into powder by starving paupers who had no idea what they were handling. The horror reached its peak in the summer of 1845 when the impossible became reality. The inmates had become so desperately hungry that they were eating the putrid bone marrow and gristle from the very bones they were supposed to be crushing. Samuel Green, a 61-year-old former inmate, gave testimony that would haunt parliamentary investigators. "We used to be like a parcel of dogs after them. Some were not so particular about the bones being fresh as others. I have picked a sheep's head, a mutton bone, and a beef bone. That was when they were fresh and good. Sometimes I have had one that was stale and stunk, and I eat it even then." He continued, "I eat it when it was stale and stinking because I was hungered, I suppose. You see, we only had bread and gruel for breakfast, and as there was no bread allowed on meat days for dinner, we saved our bread from breakfast. And then, having had only gruel for breakfast, we were hungry before dinner time." The inmates had been reduced to scavenging like wild animals, fighting over the rotting remains of dead creatures, gnawing on bones that had been sitting in the yard for weeks, covered in maggots and decay. Charles Lewis, another former inmate, described the desperation. "The marrow was as good as the meat. It was all covered over by bone, and no filth could get to it. I eat the stale and stinking meat to satisfy our hunger a little, because a pint and a half of gruel is not much for a man's breakfast." This cannibalistic desperation wasn't the result of accident or oversight. It was the result of systematic starvation, orchestrated by McDougal, who was diverting food funds for his own profit. The inmates' official rations were already below the subsistence diet decreed by the Poor Law Commission, and then McDougal was stealing even that meager allocation. Hugh Mundy, one of the few sympathetic guardians, raised concerns at board meetings, but found little support except for a decision to suspend bone crushing during hot weather. Not because of the human suffering, but because of the smell. When Mundy took his concerns to local MP Thomas Wakely, the story exploded into national scandal. On August 1845, Wakely stood in Parliament and described paupers quarreling with each other about the bones, of extracting the marrow, and of gnawing the meat. The Home Secretary expressed disbelief that such horrors were possible in civilized England, but promised an immediate investigation. Henry Parker, the Assistant Poor Law Commissioner, was dispatched to Andover to uncover the truth. What Parker found defied human decency. The bone-crushing operation had become a grotesque marketplace where starving men bid against each other for the privilege of gnawing rotting horse bones. Fighting erupted whenever a particularly fresh bone appeared, men reduced to the level of scavenging dogs, desperately clawing at putrid meat to stay alive. The Parliamentary Select Committee investigation that followed revealed the full scope of McDougal's corruption. He was purchasing bones at 17-19 shillings per ton and selling the ground fertilizer at 23-24 shillings per ton, pocketing the profits while his charges slowly starved to death. Even more damning was the revelation that some of the guardians themselves had been buying the processed bone meal at discount prices, profiting from the very system that was literally grinding human dignity into powder. The investigation uncovered that McDougal had been sexually abusing female inmates, drinking on duty, and systematically stealing food meant for the starving paupers. Between 1837 and 1846, 61 inmates had committed crimes serious enough to be sent to actual prison, suggesting they preferred the harsh conditions of jail to the living hell of Andover Workhouse. The workhouse medical officer had known about the abuse, but feared for his job. He watched men waste away from starvation and said nothing. He witnessed the bone gnawing and remained silent. He was complicit in a system that had turned human beings into carrion feeders. The scandal destroyed McDougal and forced his resignation, but the damage was done. Hundreds of men had been reduced to eating rotting animal remains to survive. Their dignity had been crushed as thoroughly as the bones they were forced to pulverize. The Andover scandal led to the abolition of bone crushing in workhouses nationwide and contributed to major reforms of the poor law system. But for the men who had been reduced to gnawing putrid horse bones while their master grew fat on stolen food, no reform could restore what had been taken from them. Some institutions break bodies, others break spirits. Andover Workhouse broke something deeper. It broke the fundamental human contract that those with care will not reduce their charges to the level of scavenging animals fighting over rotting scraps. The bone gnawers of Andover remind us that the distance between civilization and barbarity can be measured in the empty stomachs of the powerless and the full pockets of those who profit from their suffering. Subscribe to the Midnight Whispers for true horror from forgotten files, one unforgettable story, one haunted night. Dare to join us?